Hello, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're connecting today. My name is Christina Galan. I am part of the Red Mat Events team, and I will also be moderating today. Welcome to this webinar, Integrating Long Duration Energy Storage Technologies in Data Centers. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping rules, and then we will get to meet our speakers for today. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send it to everyone in a couple of days to your emails, since all of you have registered to this webinar. We have two ways of connecting today. So for those who are connected on YouTube, you have a chat there available to let us know a little bit about you. Who are you? Where you're coming from, and why are you interested in this webinar? And also, if you have any questions you would like to send to the speakers today, you can also send it through the chat. Our technical team will send them our way. If you're connecting from Zoom, you have sorry, I had a window here. You have a chat to also introduce yourselves, let us know who you are, where you're coming from, and a little bit about you, why you're interested in this webinar. And for questions, we have a specific Q&A box. So our speakers can see all the questions that are coming in and can answer. This will be a discussion. There will be no presentations. So we encourage everyone to use the Q&A section and help us create a really great discussion. I think that's all from my side. So without further ado, let's get to meet our speakers for today. So let's start with Spencer Stanton from Jupiter Power. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Spencer Stanton, I'm a senior manager with Jupiter Power on the origination side of things. Jupiter Power is a storage-focused IPP with about a gigawatt hour operating in ERCOT currently and an 11 gigawatt pipeline across the US with durations ranging from 2 to 12 hours. Mostly LFP focused to date, but we're technology agnostic, constantly looking at what's kind of on the horizon and what's next in these markets. My role within Jupiter is to be commercial facing, deal with utilities, with CNI customers, with data center, hyperscaler type customers, trying to figure out what their pain points are and how exactly our storage projects can solve them. Prior to Jupiter, I was in a power trading role at Ørsted, major developer of wind, solar, and battery storage. And I was focused on kind of the US onshore markets there. But pleasure to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Spencer, for being with us today. We also have Pavel Molchanov from Raymond James. Hi, Pavel. How are you doing today?
Good afternoon or morning, everybody. Pavel Molchanov. I've been a research analyst at Raymond James for 21 years, focused on anything and everything that pertains to sustainability, energy transition, and climate. And that certainly includes the power storage food chain and the whole conversation around data centers and AI. Delighted to answer any questions you have later on.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Pavel. All right, so let's start with questions, and we do have a couple of pre-submitted ones, but we want to hear the audience's questions today. But to start, we do have one. So the first one I'm going to start with is one that I'm starting with all the webinars from this series of events to promote our LDS storage events on the 25th and 26th of September in Washington. And it is, what do you consider are LDS technologies and how can they impact data centers? So Spencer, since you're not on mute, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a good question. I think the definition of long duration energy storage probably changes depending on who you're asking, what market you're in. For Texas, for example, a 4-hour system would be considered long duration. I think the DOE, US DOE is looking at 10-hour plus. There's a blatant need for multi-day storage. So, the definition specifically is a little bit fuzzy, and I think that, is for a real reason. Different grids need different kind of levels of duration. And in terms of where LDES fits in to the data center space, I think it helps to kind of understand what's going on with the penetration of these data centers, and what the constraints that the grid operators and utilities are facing and kind of trying to deal with. So at this point, we're all familiar with the load that AI and cloud computing is ushering in. And the nature of that load is pretty constant. It's 24/7 around the clock. It's not necessarily dispatchable or curtailable. And so for the utilities or grid operators, this makes a very good customer for the vast majority of the year. But for the 300, 500 hours of peak demand, a lot of utilities and countries are seeing this as detrimental, potentially being the difference between facing blackouts or maintaining reliability. And so the challenge is for these utilities is how can these hyperscale data center customers become dispatchable during those 300, 500 hours a year? And that is where long duration storage and storage broadly can help fit in. It can be a vehicle to enable these data centers to be dispatchable, to be off the kind of grid operator utility system for those 300, 500 hours a year, which in some cases could be, the difference between gaining an interconnection agreement or not. I speak previously about the potential for blackouts and kind of the modeling process for grid operators. It's really those peak periods that they're solving for. And so we've started to see moratoriums for data centers in countries like the Netherlands, Singapore, Dublin, where they're requiring data center customers to bring their own power, have on-site solutions. And battery storage today, specifically long duration energy storage, could be the most deployable and really the only clean way to do that, to enable dispatchability for otherwise non-dispatchable loads in a clean type of way. So I think there's definitely a lot of room for growth for storage on site and for data centers, and we're just kind of reaching the initial early stages of deployment. But it's definitely going to be a tool that both data center customers and utilities alike will value moving forward.
Yeah, and listen, Spencer is exactly right in highlighting the geographic kind of complexity of all this. In other words, this is not a one size fits all conversation. So going beyond the definition of how many hours would be classified as long duration, let's think about some of the specific technologies that are available. So we can put them into kind of two buckets. One is battery based, and one is non-battery based. Sometimes that second one gets overlooked. So battery-based technologies that are available today, for commercial purchase, that have the long duration capabilities. One that I would highlight is iron air batteries. So this is, for example, comes from a company called Form Energy. There is a zinc hybrid battery solution. This would be, for example, from a company called EOS Energy Enterprises. And then going outside of batteries, so batteries, of course, are defined as having a chemical storage medium. So non-chemical, non-battery based solutions. Well, the one that people have had for 100 years is pumped hydro. Now, the challenge with pumped hydro is you can only do it in places where there is hydroelectricity. So that's great in Quebec, that's great in Brazil or Norway. But if you're in an arid climate, Saudi Arabia or Arizona, you're not going to have a lot of hydro. So that option is very geographically limited. Another one that's geographically limited is molten salt. So molten salt we typically see in the context of concentrating solar power. So you have a concentrating solar power plant and you have a molten salt storage systems. This is not common. And thinking about geography, you have to have very high amounts of sunlight. So Arizona, Nevada, Chile, Australia, uh, Spain, and Portugal. These are good choices for molten salt. The last one I'll mention, and this is maybe kind of the newest flavor of storage, is gravity storage. So similar conceptually to pumped hydro, except you do not use water. The company that develops gravity storage that some of you may have heard of is Energy Vault via ULT. And they have these 20-ton bricks that essentially go up and down. And as the gravitational energy in the 20-ton brick either goes higher or lower, you have energy being charged or discharged. And this is also a good example, very nascent technology, but a good example of long duration.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that long story short explanation with examples. Pavel, I think it helps a lot because sometimes we only think of a couple technologies there, but there's a really big array in the LDS landscape. So another question that we have that we talked about was about regulation policy. These are important factors when it comes to LDS. So one of the questions that we have is, how do you see the regulation going, the different areas? What is the role of the federal governments and state governments right now connected to regulation?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So, the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy has done really good job tracking and prioritizing the deployment and kind of establishment of commercial pathways for long duration energy storage. So they've released a liftoff report in the public domain. Definitely recommend it as a good read. And basically what they've determined is that the lowest cost pathway to net zero by 2050 includes 440 gigawatts of long duration energy storage by 2050. So obviously a massive, kind of uplift for developers across the US. But I want to highlight that point that there is true economic benefits to having long duration energy storage on the system, even beyond just the reliability or kind of decarbonization benefits that it provides. So through that pathway, the DOE determined that it would lead to $20 billion of annual savings compared to kind of the next best pathway. I saw that Will McNamara is on here from Sandia. The DOE has set up a great consortium for kind of LDES deployment and commercialization where, each week multiple teams kind of just get together and chat about, how do we bring these technologies that are undeniably essential to the market. I think we do have a long way to go, and just like critical technologies of the past, the federal government will have a big role in kind of paving that pathway. And I think states are starting to catch on to these trends as well. California is certainly a leader with SB 100, which basically mandates 2 gigawatts of LDES procurement by 2035. And from the commercial side, you're starting to see the state policy being reflected in RFPs and what the utilities are asking for, 8-10 hour durations. And that's just a very real example that we're seeing in real time of how kind of state policy can lead to kind of commercial decisions and really, get to the level of deployment that we need. New York's another state with policy in place, and I know that there's a bill working through the Massachusetts legislature now, which is targeting, 8-10 hour plus, but also has a carve out specifically for multi-day storage. So there's kind of those two different buckets. So those are kind of a few of the leaders. I think we're going to need broad adoption across the United States and the world, frankly, to get near that 440 gigawatts of deployment. But long story short, they're going to play a very big role, and I do think that the U.S. DOE today is taking the right steps to kind of pave those commercial pathways.
Yeah, so there are actually 16 states, 1/6, that have some regulatory requirement for power storage, um, applied to the electric utilities operating in that state. Now, in case, some of you might think this is only the Democratic or the liberal, blue states. Not true. This is a great example how it actually has nothing to do with politics. So some of the states that, again, mandate their local utilities to implement storage includes Utah and North Carolina, Kentucky, Indiana. These are definitely not politically liberal or Democratic Party controlled states. Uh, you know, as well as obviously there are also states like California that are politically liberal. But in this case, this is not a political issue. It's a much more technical question, right? Of how regulators state by state are approaching this. There is no mandate at the federal level. There never has been. And frankly, that's because utility regulation in the U.S. Has always been overwhelmingly state by state. At the federal level, the policy that is 2 years old with the Inflation Reduction Act is the tax credit for power storage. So, as we like to say, this is a carrot rather than a stick, which means it is, generally speaking, politically popular, right? Governments, politicians always love giving out free money. Let's look at the other side of the Atlantic. There is no battery or power storage mandate at the level of the European Union. There are some recommendations from the European Commission in Brussels, but not a mandate. There are several EU members, individual EU members, that have their own power storage requirement for their own utilities. And then outside the EU, the UK, with the Energy Act 2023, also imposed a national power storage mandate for the British sort of utility market as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point Pavel raises, is that there's no reason for long duration energy storage to be politicized. This is an essential technology. And as mentioned before, there's an economic uplift, an economic proposition of these technologies as well, especially as we move into the later parts of this decade, 2030s, certainly by 2050. And so, just kind of echo that point in these kind of divisive times we're in, is just to lean into the technological advancements and the technological and economic arguments as a way to kind of slice through, some of the divisive politics that we all have to face in this industry.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that answer. Moving on, we already have questions on the Q&A section. So let's start with one of the first ones that we have from Nuha. She says, or he says, can you talk a little bit more about the challenge data centers are experiencing when it comes to securing contracting from capacity? Also, what examples can you share of when batteries have been deployed to provide flexible capacity?
Yeah, sure. So, in a lot of the power constrained markets that data centers are pouring into, Ohio is an example, Northern Indiana, Dallas, the traditional markets, Chicago, Northern Virginia, Phoenix. Not all of these have capacity markets, but the Indiana and PJM markets, for example, utilities are requiring new load to procure capacity directly. And I'd say in these markets, capacity for storage, whether it's long or short duration, is a very important revenue stream. And so there's kind of a big commercial opportunity here to partner directly with these new loads that need to be served and have this capacity procurement requirement with a battery, and also potentially, offer hedging services and protection against price volatility kind of in one one structured product. I think the capacity requirements, just speculating, but as grids become more constrained, the capacity procurement requirements will become stricter and kind of potentially more burdensome. So it potentially opens up a further commercial pathway for storage, long duration storage. The other thing to note there is if you look at PGM, for example, the Eastern grids, grid operators capacity accreditation forecast for 4-hour storage, it's about 20% less than what a 10-hour battery would get today. And as you look out a 10-year horizon, that kind of mid 50s capacity accreditation for 4-hour storage drops to 30s or 20s, whereas a 10-hour capacity accreditation in the mid upper 70s stays relatively constant over that 10-year period. So that is actually kind of a market design element. And it's a very good question, but that's a market design element that I could see kind of coming to a head and incentivizing long duration procurements specifically, just to kind of get that higher capacity value and also maintain it over a longer period. But it's still an evolving space. But I do think that capacity markets and capacity accreditation will be a pretty critical tool in terms of incentivizing the build out that we need. And I think it's something that data center customers specifically should be tuned in and on, because I think procurement requirements are very likely to become more stringent.
It's an evolving market. It's also just nascent, right? Like everything we're talking about here is early stage. I mean, maybe not pump hydro, but everything else fundamentally is in the early stage of commercialization. Some of it, the nickel zinc batteries or the iron air batteries are extremely early in their adoption curve. So just to give you a statistic on this, Amazon at the end of 22, so this is a little while ago, but pretty recent, had 450 megawatts of power storage for the entire company. 450 megawatts would be maybe two of these, hyperscale kind of AI level data centers, which go up to, as much as 300 megawatts. So 450 for an entire company just gives you a sense of how early stage.
Okay, well, thank you for that. One of the questions that are coming up also are, I don't know if this is maybe too early to answer this question just because of what we're saying, that it's still a very niche market and there's still a lot to find out. But time can only provide that. But what are the key characteristics of LDS that are specific to data centers applications such as scale, duration, and even cost? Some people are asking in the chat.
Well, I'll touch on a variable that Christina, you actually did not mention, but I think it's worth adding. All of those are good ones, of course, and that's the form factor.
Okay.
So data centers can be built anywhere, right? And the difference is storage technologies, we touched on this a few minutes ago, are frequently, more suited to certain specific locations. And depending on where the data center is, there is a range of storage solutions that are simply not viable. So, I gave the example, if it's a data center in Arizona, you're not going to have pumped hydro, right? As a local storage option, period. So form factor is partly a conversation about kind of the local geography or the local climate conditions, but it's also physically a matter of space. So as I think a lot of people on this call are aware, there are more data centers in the state of Virginia than in all of Europe. Europe has a lot, right? But Virginia by itself is that much. So in and around the giant metro area of Washington, D.C., people are not going to be able to get access to vast amounts of land for anything. It's not available, and it's certainly too expensive. So compactness, or another way to frame it, energy density, is very valuable, because otherwise it's just not going to be a practical solution in those communities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and totally agree. Um, I think in regards to Christina's question, LDA specifically for data centers, I think a lot of the applications we're seeing today, LFP deployments, they're great at intraday volatility, shaving peak demand costs, and I think they're very capable of extending to the 10, 12-hour period. But what data center customers are looking for is 72 to 100 hours of redundancy of coverage. And as of today, like there is not a clean solution. There's not a way to get there without economically without having some sort of fuel on site, primarily natural gas. So that's where I think as we look forward, as these technologies that Pavel mentioned mature, that's kind of the market share that I could see them eating into. It's how do you essentially minimize the amount of fuel burning technologies you have to have on site? How can energy storage do that? I want to make another point to the density question. So land density is a huge consideration, energy density as well. So I just want to kind of highlight some of the advances we've seen in just LFP storage technology today. So in 2020, before COVID hit, a typical LFP DC block was 40-foot long, and each container had around 3.5 megawatt hours of capacity in the container. Today, the typical LFP container on the market is 20, and each of those containers have 5.1 megawatt hours of capacity is what Cattle is out there marketing. So just in a 4-year period, we've cut the land footprint in half of LFP cells, of LFP technologies, and we've increased the power output by 40%. On top of that, costs have decreased by an order of magnitude. So I do think for the intraday, even up to potentially 12, 15, 24 hours, the cost declines, the density improvements, and the land footprint that LFP is providing is going to be very tough for kind of these nascent lab scale technologies to compete with. But there's a very real need and kind of a big question mark around how do we get to the multi-day coverage that the data centers or customers are requiring. So I think that's the market share that long duration solutions will eventually begin to tap into.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for that. A question that is gaining traction here is from Hank, and it's a question for Spencer. What is the market for providing thermal loads at the data centers, HVAC, etc.? Utilizing thermal storage technologies might be providing the more optimal cost options at large scale compared to the conventional electricity-hungry HVAC systems.
Yeah. So I must start to say that that's definitely not my area of expertise. But I think it falls into the category of like all the above type of solutions are needed. There's definitely a huge advancements we've seen in thermal storage technologies. And the cooling and HVAC load of these data centers is one of the largest considerations. If you're relying on liquid cooling, water quickly becomes a constraint. If you're not, power becomes more of a constraint. So that's kind of a trade-off you have to give. But I'd say high level, I think they're definitely needed, and there's certainly a market for it. It's not necessarily the application that will enable a data center to kind of go off grid for 4 hours or 6 or 10 hours at a time, at least from what I've seen deployed today. But again, not an expert on thermal storage, and I could would be eager to see improvements and deployments of that technology as well. I don't know if Pavel has any further insight into thermal technologies or companies.
Yeah, it's definitely nascent, Spencer. And essentially everybody who's involved in thermal batteries is a startup, right? This has been deployed in a very select number of locations. Now, it's important to differentiate. This is not the same thing as molten salt. So molten salt, I said, is typically combined with concentrating solar power. So this is in the very sunny, parts of the world, right? Thermal batteries have the advantage of, they can be deployed like other batteries just about anywhere. Uh, the um, the applications that are particularly well suited to thermal storage are include the kind of industrial, so steel mills, chemical plants, that sort of thing. They can also be applied to data centers and more kind of the commercial enterprise market. So some of the startups here that you know, some of our listeners may be familiar with. There's a U.S. company called Rondo, Rondo. There is another U.S. company called Micro Era Power. There is a company in Finland called Elstor, Elstor, and maybe a handful of others, but it's a relatively short list of players, and they are all Malta, Malta, another U.S. based startup that I did not mention earlier, but pretty short list. And again, everybody is early stage.
Right. I think we even have some of those technologies you mentioned here today. So thank you for that. Perfect. Well, next question comes from actually one of our speakers at the event, which is Will McNamara from the LDS Consortium. With respect to defining opportunities for LDES, do the panelists agree that the significant but varying levels of renewables penetration across the US is a key criterion?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think definitely. I think where you're seeing this play out, where you might see this play out first, certainly in California with solar penetration, and then obviously, state level mandates. But, in Texas, we have, 30 gigawatts, 35 gigawatts of wind penetration overnight. Just this week, for the first time, we've surpassed 20 gigawatts of solar penetration. 2 years ago, 6 gigawatts of a solar performance was huge. So I feel like there's like an upper bound limit of how much renewables you can have on a system while maintaining reliability. That is dependent on how much storage and how much duration you have on the system. So, you know, ERCOT is an early mover on wind and solar deployments and storage. We now have around 7 gigawatts on the system. Most of those batteries are 1 to 2 hours. I think duration will continue to kind of expand over the next 20 years. And if we're talking about a system that's 80% reliant on wind or solar, it will demand longer duration periods to cover those wind and solar droughts. It's just kind of an inevitable, I think, kind of step by step type of process. But to your question, I think certainly wind and solar penetration is a leading indicator of where long duration storage will be needed.
Yeah, and maybe just to give a bit of international perspective on this. So in the US, wind and solar combined is 15% of the electricity mix. Is that high or low? Well, compared to some of the other kind of G20 major economies, it's actually on the lower side. So Germany, 40%, 40. UK, 40%. Brazil and Australia are around 25, so almost double where the US is. So this is, and if we look at some of the smaller economies, Denmark, famously, with half of its electricity is offshore wind. The the urgency of managing the intermittency of the grid because of very high renewable penetration, it's the U.S. is definitely not leading the way in that regard. It's certainly evolving, as is China, but it's in Europe we see more of this, and several other parts of the world, and particularly in the Western Hemisphere, where renewables are moving forward quite aggressively.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I do think in the U.S., obviously a massive system, large geographic footprint. California could be considered its own, country. And there are periods of time this year where we've seen wind, water, solar storage meet near 100% of demand on an hourly level. Like I'm not talking about over a period of weeks, but I think there was something like a 3-week span where we saw hours 100% met by renewables. ERCOT in Texas, we've gotten up to the 75% range already, and we're just at the beginning. But yeah, I do think that in order to maintain reliability while increasing the penetration, we're just going to have to continue to extend duration over the course of the next 20 years. But definitely agree with all Pavel's points and appreciate the international perspective as well.
Definitely. Perfect. Next question. What is the best way to bring forward for demonstration those technology innovations responding to data center energy storage or system cooling demands? Pavel, I see you on
Well,
mute.
maybe I guess there are different maybe things to unpack here. One aspect of demonstration, by definition, is that somebody needs to pay for it, and presumably the question comes from a startup of some kind. So if you're a startup and you want to commercially validate your technology, yes, you have to have demo deployments. So who's going to pay for it? Well, there are basically three options. Okay, you can pay for it yourself, which may or may not be financially realistic. So let's suppose it's not financially realistic for you to self-finance deployment number one. Then you have two choices. You can either find a commercial customer who is willing to be a bit of an experiment, right? For the inaugural commercial demo. And so in the data center conversation, that can be a data center operator like Equinix. It might be one of the big techs directly, Amazon or Meta, et cetera. It's not easy to develop a commercial relationship between a startup and a giant Fortune 500 company, to state the obvious. So then the other option is to get government funding. And that can be in the US, that might be, US Department of Energy provides some grants, or including grants for demonstration projects. It might be a state, so NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Agency, or the California equivalent of that, for example. And then if we look at Europe, the European Commission provides funding for kind of early stage technology deployment, as do many of the EU member states. Germany, would be obviously the biggest one in terms of financial capability. So also not easy. These are very competitive. right? It's getting a government grant in the millions of dollars or euros is not going to be quick or straightforward, but sometimes that is the best option from the perspective of a startup.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the good news is that you're seeing a lot more activity both on the corporate and utility side around focusing on long duration non-lithium procurement. So, you have Excel in Colorado, they have the pilot with Forum Energy to replace retiring coal plant. Dominion has done something similar. SRP in Phoenix, for example, put out an RFP last week asking for up to 50 megawatts of non-lithium long duration solutions. So there's the demand from the utilities, which I think will be essential, is coming. There was also this year, there was a kind of first of kind joint RFI requests from Microsoft, Google, and Nucor, who together were specifically looking to kind of like bring some of these technologies into the commercial realm, which is the first we've seen of that. I don't think it's the last by any means. But to Pavel's point, there is kind of a gap between kind of the lab scale um, and lab level technology and getting it to kind of a minimum viable technology readiness level. And I think that gap is kind of the most difficult to address. And that's where federal funding, grant programs, state level as well become really, really important. But I think it's an effort, and all of the above type of effort, including capital markets and venture funds as well. Um, all levels of this funding will be essential to get to the level of deployment. But there is reason for optimism. Just in some of the recent RFPs, if you sift through IRP data, long duration is being mentioned across the country by almost every utility. And now that we have this influx of data center demand, we're starting to see commercial players also start pay attention to it. So I remain optimistic that commercial pathways will develop, but there will continue to be necessary funding to kind of get these technologies to a minimum kind of viable level.
Mhm. Definitely. One of the big questions that I hear a lot around LDS is bankability. So in your opinion, can the capacity market provide revenue for plus 10 years to make LDS bankable?
If the technology has been commercially validated, then it will gradually kind of enhance its bankability. So bankability is not like flipping a light switch, okay, from yes to no immediately. It does not work that way. So it's a process. If there is a startup with a completely new concept, battery or something other than a battery, it goes through uh, uh, multiple steps before it becomes bankable. So there might be a pilot deployment, then there will be a demonstration scale deployment, then there will be the first truly commercial deployment, maybe supported by a government grant, then another commercial deployment without government support. And the more projects that get built, the more bankability that technology accumulates. So it's not it's not an instantaneous dynamic, but think of it as a process, and this is measured in years. So this is a marathon rather than a sprint.
Perfect. Another question that we have is if you see any role of green hydrogen fuel cells as a backup solution. I think for what Spencer mentions is here previously 72 to 100 hours of backup needed for data centers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been substantial commercial, demonstrations on the fuel cell front. I think fuel availability of hydrogen will continue to be a challenge. I think some of the solid oxide fuel cells like that Bloom's putting out, and some others, Fuel Cell Energy, for example, that have mainspring is actually a linear generator, but another example that I think could fall into this category, but that have fuel flexibility, where they could burn, natural gas, maybe that's renewable natural gas as a bridge to, actual hydrogen viability. I think those could be really interesting. Just comes down to cost and kind of a economic, benefit analysis. I think, it's really tough to compete against traditional combined cycles. They're cheap and they can burn, readily available natural gas across the country. So that's kind of the benchmark. And I see a question in here is like, what's going to incentivize long-term storage spend when, there's natural gas and combined cycles readily available at disposal? I think it's the same question for fuel cells. And I think that comes from consumer demand, the same way we've seen, shareholders and boards demand cleaner solutions. The reality is, if a certain, data center customer is going to, increase their load by 25, 50, 100% in the next 10 years, they also have these very public 2030 decarbonization goals to the hourly level, 24/7 matching their load with clean energy. It's not going to be able to be done 100% with natural gas. And I think utilities, corporates, local governments are starting to recognize that we need other solutions as well. So that's just kind of fundamental market-based drivers that I think will push procurements for technologies like fuel cells in the future. Again, I think fuel availability, in some places it might not be a problem, but there's not excess of hydrogen on the market by any means today for those plants to burn. So I think it's still another case where it's, a marathon, not necessarily a sprint.
What I'd like to do is make sure everybody understands that a fuel cell is not a storage solution. A fuel cell is a generator of electricity. It does not store power, it generates power. So to generate power at a data center on site, traditionally, people would be burning diesel in a conventional generator from a company like Generac or Caterpillar. That is not a good thing from an environmental or ESG perspective. So you can think about, okay, let's use natural gas. So burning natural gas in a turbine from somebody like GE, could be Caterpillar also, or Vernova, formerly GE. So, okay, that's better than diesel. A fuel cell uses natural gas and it does not involve any combustion. There is a chemical reaction happening inside of a fuel cell. We don't need to get into the physics of it, but it's suffice it to say it is more climate friendly than burning natural gas and a lot more climate friendly than burning diesel. But again, this is not a storage. This is a generator. So mainspring would be another example of a natural gas based power generation solution. Fuel cells definitely provide not just long duration, but potentially infinite duration, because again, they are generating power. As long as the natural gas is flowing right through a pipeline, the fuel cell will be generating electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years and years. So it's not an add-on to the electric grid. It is in a certain sense a replacement for the grid, because the data center or a hotel or a hospital can become completely independent of the grid if it has a large enough fuel cell system deployed.
I think that's a really good clarification. I think where storage like hypothetically could play in concert with a fuel cell is you have tanks above ground storing your fuel, or you have pipelines packed full of it storing fuel there. But what you'll find is from a land density footprint, some of these storage technologies can store immense amounts of power and a much smaller footprint. So, you know, we did the math of some of these 5.1 megawatt hour, 20-foot containers can very comfortably fit a gigawatt hour of power on 8 acres. If you're storing all of your fuel in tanks above ground, one, it's very hazardous. Permitting is a nightmare. But from a land footprint perspective, which is, as mentioned before, is a very important consideration, storage of the fuel is not extremely efficient. And to Pavel's point, fuel cells themselves aren't storage vessels.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for that uh, clarification, very much needed. Next question, I don't think there is, but just in case, one of the questions is, are there existing or possibly future policies or programs that will benefit the utilization of LDS for data centers specifically? Not
Not
that
that
I'm
I'm
aware
aware
of.
of for data centers specifically, but it's a good question.
You never know.
Remember the tax credit. This is in the United States. The federal tax credit, which is 30%, 30%, that is available for every power storage system. So if whoever the owner of that system is gets a tax credit in the year that the system is completed or commissioned. So if it's a $10 million system, the credit is $3 million. I mean, it's very, very simple in that sense.
Okay, perfect. Next question. Should storage capacity be available physically nearby DC asset, or can it be contractualized virtually with an example time shifting contract?
I think either option's on the table. I think there are mechanisms and markets that are being created to kind of establish this hourly tracking, hourly rec equivalent type of market, where storage can start to really add benefit to the kind of CNI customer that's been so essential in scaling wind and solar deployments. Today there's not much of a pathway from an environmental attribute standpoint that storage can offer to those folks. But those markets, Level 10 is working on it. Energy Tag has established some really detailed standards of how this might work. So that's a market that's evolving that will enable kind of the virtual firming of the wind and solar PPAs that all these hyperscalers already have. I think that's a really interesting use case. I do think having the storage on site, like to the extent that it's possible, you can do that same thing. You can still firm the wind and solar PPAs on an hourly level, track the charge and discharge records and mint these kind of hourly granular certificates or GEOs. Different markets have different names for them, but you also can provide that direct on-site reliability benefit, and also, take that load off the system, evade demand charges. So there's an added element that potentially on-site storage could offer. But if you're talking of significant gigawatt scale, it might just not make sense to have that size of a battery on site. And there's certainly pathways to do that virtually as well.
Spencer covered it.
Okay, perfect. All right, our time's almost up. Time flies, has flown very, very fast. So I have one last question. I think this is kind of a personal one, a kind of a bet, but with such a vast number of competing technologies out there, which ones you think may prevail in the medium and long term, and for what reasons?
Not a zero-sum game. This is not about company A versus company B. Let's be clear. The
Well, we're talking about
uh,
technologies, not
right.
companies exactly.
Well, I think the same
Okay.
point applies. The same point applies. So what we should be enthusiastic about as it relates to power storage adoption broadly and for data centers specifically is that the scale of the opportunity, the addressable market is massive. And as I said, when Amazon has 450 megawatts and that's it, we know that the level of penetration today is extremely small. So to get from where we are today to even 25 or 30% penetration would be massive growth. And there is room for a lot of technologies to be commercially successful. They're not going to be the best option in every location. So again, we talked about the hydro aspect, the solar aspect, the energy density or form factor aspect. So all of these are variables that on a case by case basis, certain ones will be the best candidate. But because the market is so big, there is room for all of these things to ultimately work.
Yeah, I was going to say just about the same thing. I think a solution that works in Texas might, be nonsensical in the Northeast, or I think it's just very geographic dependent. We talked about salt cavern storage. There's another company called HydroStore that's doing something similar, but in basalt and limestone, where they're kind of carving out caverns, new caverns to do that. And maybe that's more geographic dependent. But we're going to need all of these solutions. There's not going to be a silver bullet, and the storage and duration requirement in any given market's totally different. So I think there's market share for a lot of participants to gain. So just echo Pavel's point. I think it's important for all of us from the development side, but also from the utility procurement C&I side, to just keep an open mind and recognize that each kind of geographic region is going to have a totally different and acute need that a different technology can serve. So really excited to see the progress that we all make over the next 10 years, and I have no doubt that a lot of people on this call will have a kind of instrumental impact on that
Absolutely.
development.
So it's going to come down to every specific use case, and as we said before, not every technology fits every situation. So that's why we need more technologies and we need a lot to figure out. But our time's up. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We had a couple of questions that we haven't been able to respond. However, we'll send them to our speakers, but we will also have our on-site event on the 25th and 26th of September. So you should join us and hear amazing speakers such as Spencer and Pavel. And if not, we hope to see everyone on the remaining webinars we have for this year. I think we might stop for August, but we will be back in September. So we hope everyone has a wonderful day and hope to see everyone very, very soon.
Thank
So
you.
thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Appreciate it.